The silence in the small apartment was the loudest sound Ilara knew. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from the absence of her husband's laughter and the low hum of the television he used to watch. She sat at the rickety kitchen table, the wood cool and splintered beneath her forearms. On its surface, under the weak glow of a single bare bulb, lay her entire world, $178. A stack of worn bills and a sad little pile of coins she had counted and recounted, as if the simple act of touching them could somehow make them multiply. Her stomach ached with a familiar, hollow pain, a hunger she had been ignoring for days to ensure her son, Leo, had enough to eat. She could feel the chill of the evening seeping through the window frames, a damp cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the stark, pink eviction notice taped to her front door. A tremor ran through her, a deep shiver of fear that started in her bones. The city outside buzzed with life, but in here there was only the smell of dust and the crushing weight of impending doom. The company had called it a logging accident, a tragically unforeseen event. The words were cold and clinical on the formal letter that arrived with the settlement check, a sum so paltry it felt like a final, cruel joke. It was just enough to bury the man she loved, to pay for a cheap wooden box and a small unforgettable plot of land. After that, nothing, not a single cent left over. Ilara ran a finger over a framed photograph on the wall, her husband's smiling face now covered in a thin layer of dust. She no longer had the energy to wipe away. She felt her heart physically tighten in her chest, a familiar vice grip of grief that still stole her breath. She remembered the settlement check, the crisp paper feeling like poison in her hands. They had taken his life, his warmth, his future, and in return, they had given her just enough money to dispose of the body. A nausea rose in her throat at the memory. The injustice of it was a constant, burning coal in the pit of her stomach. She was a librarian, a woman of words and order, but no words could describe this profound emptiness. The eviction notice was the final punctuation mark on her sentence of misery. Its bold red letters seemed to scream at her from the front door every time she passed it. Vacate premises. She had memorized the date, a merciless deadline now only 3 days away. The legal jargon was a blur, but the message was brutally clear. They would be homeless. The thought sent a jolt of pure animal terror through her spine, a fear not for herself, but for Leo. He was only 10. In the next room, she could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing as he slept. That sound was her anchor, the one thing tethering her to sanity. How could she tell him they had nowhere to go? How could she watch the light of childhood innocence extinguish from his eyes? Her hands trembled as she imagined them on the street, another faceless, tragic story swallowed by the city. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead. She felt a primal, protective rage bubble up, only to be instantly smothered by a wave of complete and utter powerlessness. She was a mother, and she was failing her child. Shame was a taste in her mouth, more bitter than the lukewarm water she now drank instead of coffee. She watched Leo at the table earlier, sketching furiously in a worn notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a growing boy, and his dinner had been a meager bowl of watered-down canned soup. He never complained. He just ate, told her it was good, and went back to his drawings, trying so hard to be the man of the house now. His bravery was a knife in her heart. She felt the hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fill their stomachs or keep a roof over their heads. She had to be the strong one, the pillar he could lean on. But the pillar was crumbling. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making her bones feel like brittle chalk. Every breath felt like a struggle. As a former librarian, she used to find comfort in stories of heroes overcoming impossible odds. But now, trapped in her own bleak narrative, she couldn't imagine a happy ending. The world of books felt like a distant, beautiful lie. Ilara walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool, grimy glass. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of lives and dramas, all of them indifferent to her own. The distant sound of a siren wailed, a fitting soundtrack for her despair. She opened her palm and stared at the crumpled bills and loose change again. $178. It was a laughable shield against the tidal wave that was about to crash down on them. A deep, soul-crushing hopelessness washed over her. It felt like sinking into cold, dark water, the pressure building, the light fading. Her husband was gone. Her home was about to be taken. Her son's future was a terrifying blank page. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her failure. It was absolute. In this moment of utter darkness, what would you do? When all hope seems lost, where do you find the strength to take one more step? Follow our story to see if a single forgotten piece of paper can change everything. And subscribe so you don't miss the unbelievable secret that awaits. The phone's shrill ring sliced through the oppressive silence, making Ilara jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was her husband's pro bono lawyer, a man with a voice as dry as old parchment. He spoke of final papers, of loose ends from a life now extinguished. Ilara listened with a numb heart, expecting nothing more than another bill or a final, formal condolence. Then he said the words that changed everything. A deed, he coughed, found it tucked away in his files, from a great-great-uncle you probably never heard of. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but a strange, electric curiosity, sparked in the cold emptiness of her chest. Her breath hitched. The lawyer continued, his tone flat and unaffected. It's for a small, forgotten plot of land deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The deed is old, but my initial check says it's legally sound. Ilara's fingers tightened on the receiver until her knuckles were white. The mountains felt a world away, an impossible distance, a phantom. She could hear the rustle of papers on his end, the sound of a forgotten history being disturbed after decades of sleep. A ghost from a past she never knew she had. There's not much to it, the lawyer droned on, his voice devoid of any wonder. The county records are sparse, almost non-existent. The only feature listed on the century-old property survey is, and this is rather strange, a giant, inhabitable treehouse, or the phrase hung in the air between them, utterly absurd, a sentence plucked from a children's storybook. A treehouse. It sounded like a whimsical fantasy, a cruel joke played by a long-dead, eccentric relative. But in the desperate, frantic workshop of Ilara's mind, a new image began to form, overriding the grim reality of the pink eviction notice. A roof, walls, a place where the city, the debts, and the crushing grief couldn't reach them. She felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, a nauseating mix of disbelief and a wild, irrational hope. Inhabitable. She whispered the word out loud, testing its weight on her tongue. It felt solid. It felt real. It was the first solid word she had held on to in months. The lawyer mumbled something about its likely state of disrepair, but Ilara barely heard him. The word was an anchor. The decision was made in a fever dream of frantic activity. There was no time for doubt, no room for the cold logic that told her this was madness. Selling their few remaining possessions, the sagging couch, her husband's favorite reading chair, the small television, yielded a pitiful sum, just enough cash for gasoline and cheap, non-perishable food. Each item sold was another tie to their old life, painfully severed. The sound of the armchair being dragged out the door felt like a final, physical goodbye to him, all over again. Ilara moved with a manic energy, a stark contrast to the crushing lethargy that had plagued her for weeks. She packed their entire lives into 2 cardboard boxes and a single, battered suitcase, clothes, the dusty photograph of her husband, and Leo's worn sketchbook. That was all that remained. As she taped the last box shut, the tearing sound of the tape felt unnaturally loud in the echoing, empty apartment. She looked at Leo, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and a boy's thirst for adventure. That innocent trust was a shard of glass in her heart. The final act was sliding the key into an envelope and pushing it under the landlord's door. An anonymous, cowardly surrender. There was no turning back. The definitive click of their own apartment door locking behind them for the very last time was a sound of absolute finality, echoing in the hollow stairwell like the closing of a casket lid. They were officially homeless, adrift, with only a brittle, century-old piece of paper and a full tank of gasoline to their name. Their car, a rattling old sedan with a perpetually lit check engine light, felt less like a vehicle and more like a lifeboat, small and fragile against the vast, indifferent city. As Ilara pulled away from the curb, she refused to look in the rearview mirror. She couldn't bear to see their home, their life, shrinking into the past. She just focused on the road ahead, her knuckles a pale white on the cracked steering wheel. Leo, beside her, pressed his face to the glass, watching the familiar landscape of their neighborhood blur and then disappear. "Are we going to be okay, Mum?" he asked. His voice small, Ilara's heart clenched. The first day was a blur of highways and concrete, the endless grey ribbon of road hypnotizing her as she put as much distance as possible between them and their failure. The dense, vertical skyline of the city slowly flattened into sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into wide, empty farmlands. The air inside the car grew stale, thick with the smells of cheap gas station coffee and unspoken anxiety. They ate dry crackers and peanut butter for dinner, the meager meal doing little to quiet the persistent, hollow ache in Ilara's stomach. She drove until her eyes burned with fatigue, until the white lines on the asphalt started to dance and merge together in the twilight. At night, they pulled into a brightly lit rest stop, reclining their seats under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that offered no real rest. Sleep was shallow and fitful, punctuated by the violent roar of passing semi-trucks and the constant nagging fear of what lay ahead. Ilara would jolt awake, her heart pounding. The image of the eviction notice burned into her mind. By the second day, the landscape had transformed completely. The flat plains buckled and rose, giving way to the rolling green foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The interstate highway system abandoned them, forcing them onto a two-lane road that twisted and coiled like a serpent through the dense or dark forests. Ancient trees, heavy with moss, formed a thick canopy overhead, plunging the road into a perpetual greenish twilight even at midday. Pockets of thick white fog clung to the hollows and valleys, swirling across the asphalt like restless spirits. The air that drifted through the open window was different now, cooler, cleaner, and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Decaying leaves, and something else. Something wild and primordial. The silence was unnerving. The constant hum of civilization had been replaced by the buzzing drone of insects and the mournful calls of birds she didn't recognize. A chill, unrelated to the temperature, ran down Ilara's spine. This felt like a world forgotten by the one she had just fled. They were traveling backward into a wilder, more unforgiving past. Her hands ached from gripping the steering wheel for hours on end, the vibrations of the struggling engine, a constant, worrying tremor. The car, protesting the steep, winding inclines, made a new series of groaning, metallic sounds. The gas gauge hovered precariously over empty, a blinking red eye of judgment. They hadn't seen another car or any sign of life for over an hour. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a physical presence, pressing in on all sides from the impenetrable wall of trees. Leo, who had been quiet for most of the drive, finally stirred. "It's like the forests in my books," he whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "Where the monsters live." Ilara's stomach tightened into a cold knot. He meant it as a fantasy, but to her, it felt like a chilling prophecy. The map, spread on the dashboard, was brittle and faded. The final turn was supposed to be a county road, but the sign was gone, leaving only a rotted wooden post. All that marked the entrance was a dirt track barely visible, being swallowed by weeds and encroaching branches. She hesitated, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The dirt track was a nightmare. Low-hanging branches scraped violently against the car's roof and windows, the sound like sharp claws trying to rip their way inside. The tires spun in the thick mud, the engine whining in protest as Ilara fought to keep them moving forward. After what felt like an eternity of this punishing advance, the track suddenly opened into a small, gloomy clearing, choked with weeds and shadowed by the surrounding woods. And there it was. Ilara slammed on the brakes, the car lurching to a final, shuddering stop. Her breath caught in her throat, and the single, beautiful word the lawyer had spoken, inhabitable, died a silent, violent death on her lips. The tree was a monster, a colossal ancient oak, its trunk wider than their car, its gnarled, leafless branches reaching toward the grey sky like skeletal fingers. It was magnificent and terrifying, and clinging to its side, perhaps 40 feet up, was the treehouse. The fragile hope that had fueled her for 2 days didn't just fade. It was instantly and brutally extinguished, leaving a black hole of despair in its place. It wasn't a house. It was a carcass, a skeletal collection of rotting timbers clinging precariously to the massive trunk. Parts of the roof had caved in completely, leaving gaping, dark wounds open to the sky. The walls were a pathetic patchwork of missing planks and wood-stained jet black with creeping rot and mildew. A single rope ladder, its fibers frayed and green with moss, dangled limply from a sagging porch, its bottom rungs missing entirely, ending a good 10 feet off the ground. It didn't look inhabited. It looked condemned by nature itself. A sudden gust of wind moaned through the clearing, and the entire structure swayed and creaked, an awful, grinding sound, like old bones rubbing together. Ilara's mind struggled to reconcile the horror in front of her with the desperate dream she had so carefully constructed. This wasn't a refuge. This was a death trap suspended in the air. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up her spine. The air itself felt wrong, heavy and watchful. She had a sudden, terrifying feeling that they were not alone here. She finally found the strength to open the car door, and the smell hit her like a physical blow. It was overwhelming, a thick, putrid stench that instantly coated the inside of her mouth and made her eyes water. It was the smell of a forgotten, waterlogged place left to fester in the darkness. The deep, earthy funk of a century of unchecked mold, the sharp, sour scent of rotting wood, and the unmistakable, musky odor of animal nests and slow decay. It was the smell of things dying slowly and silently. The scent filled her lungs, and a wave of powerful nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand, her stomach heaving violently. This smell was the final, undeniable confirmation of her failure. It was the scent of absolute destitution, far worse than the dusty poverty of their city apartment. This was the smell of the end of the line. A fat, grey rat scurried from beneath the tree's massive roots and disappeared into the undergrowth, its movement a casual assertion of ownership. A tremor of pure revulsion shook her entire body. "Mom," Leo's voice was a small, trembling thing beside her. Is this it?" He had gotten out of the car, and his face, usually so full of life and boyish curiosity, was pale and etched with a deep, sinking disbelief. The great adventure had died in his eyes, replaced by a raw, naked fear that perfectly mirrored her own. He looked from the monstrous, rotting structure in the tree to his mother's face, searching desperately for an explanation, for some reassurance that this was all a terrible mistake, a wrong turn. And in that moment, seeing the hope extinguish from her son's face, something inside Ilara finally broke. The last dam holding back her grief, her fear, her shame, and her soul-deep exhaustion finally crumbled into dust. The strength she had feigned for his sake dissolved completely. It was one thing to endure this nightmare herself, but it was another thing entirely to have dragged her innocent child into it. She had promised him a new home. Instead, she had brought him to a ruin at the edge of the world, a place more desolate and hopeless than anything they had left behind. Hot, silent tears finally began to stream down her cheeks. She didn't sob or make a sound. It was a quiet, hopeless weeping, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to fight for, when the body finally admits defeat. The cold mountain air bit at her wet skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame that was consuming her from the inside out. She had failed. The words echoed in the silence of her mind, a brutal, unforgiving mantra. She had failed her son. She had failed her husband's memory. She had driven them 1,000 miles on a fool's errand, burning their last few dollars, all to end up in a place that was objectively worse than being homeless in the city. At least on the street. There were other people, other lights. Here there was nothing, just the crushing silence of the forest, the suffocating presence of the ancient trees, and the ever-present stench of decay. The feeling of hitting rock bottom was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical location. It was this clearing, this monster tree, this rotting shack. This was the bottom of the world, and she had steered them right into its heart. As if to punctuate her despair with a final, cruel stroke of irony, the car's engine, which she had left running, gave a final, pathetic sputter and died. The sudden, absolute silence was deafening, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the skeletal branches above. The blinking red gaslight on the dashboard glowed in the dimming light, a final, mocking insult. They were out of gas. Completely. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The car, their lifeboat, their last link to civilization, their only theoretical means of escape, was now just a useless metal shell. They were stranded. The thin, fraying thread of possibility that they could simply turn around and leave was now irrevocably cut. A new kind of terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the thick fog of her despair. It wasn't just about being homeless anymore. It was about survival. They had no food beyond a few crackers, no water, no real shelter, and no way to contact anyone for help. The sun was sinking fast, and the shadows were bleeding across the clearing. She turned to look at Leo. He was shivering, though whether from the dropping temperature or from pure fear, she couldn't tell. He had wrapped his arms tightly around his torso, his small frame looking utterly fragile against the backdrop of the immense, darkening woods. The sheer weight of her responsibility settled on her shoulders, heavier and colder than ever before. The self-pitying despair was a luxury she could no longer afford. The passive sorrow had to end, because a new, more primal emotion was taking its place, a fierce, desperate instinct to protect her child. She was a mother, and her cub was in mortal danger. The thought was a jolt of ice water through her veins. This rotting shack, this suspended death trap, was now their only option for shelter against the coming night, against the bone-chilling cold, against whatever creatures roamed these lightless woods. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. The thought of attempting to climb that frayed rope ladder, of spending even a single night in that creaking, stinking ruin, filled her with a dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. The last sliver of daylight was fading from the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. The temperature was dropping fast. Ilara took a deep, shuddering breath. The foul air a bitter pill she was forced to swallow. She had to act. Now, she walked to the base of the great oak, her sneakers sinking into the soft, damp earth. She tilted her head back, her gaze tracing the path up the impossibly massive trunk to the dangling, frayed rope ladder. It looked like a single thread hanging from the maw of a giant. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to stay on the ground, to huddle in the cold, dead car and pray for morning. But when she looked over at Leo, at his pale, trusting face illuminated by the car's dying interior light, she knew she couldn't. She had to try. She had to provide some semblance of shelter, no matter how flimsy, no matter how terrifying. "Stay right by the car," she commanded, her voice a harsh, unfamiliar croak. "I'm going to see if I can get up there." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. This was the true bottom, not the arrival. But this moment, this decision to climb toward a ruin because it was the only choice she had left, the climb was a waking nightmare. Every inch of the frayed rope seemed to protest under her weight, the fibers digging into her palms, stiff and prickly with mildew. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure terror. She refused to look down, focusing instead on the splintered planks of the porch just above her, the single point of hope in a vertical world of fear. The wind moaned through the branches, making the entire structure creak and sway with an awful groaning sound, and with every gust she felt the rope shift, imagining it snapping, picturing herself plummeting to the hard, unforgiving ground below. Her muscles screamed in protest, her arms burning with an exhaustion that felt bone deep. She could hear Leo's small, frightened voice calling up to her, and that sound, that fragile tether to her purpose, was the only thing that forced her to pull herself up, hand over agonizing hand. The stench of rot grew stronger with every foot she gained, a foul greeting from the ruin that awaited her. Swinging one leg over the edge of the porch, Ilara collapsed onto the floorboards, her body trembling uncontrollably. The wood beneath her was terrifyingly soft and spongy, yielding slightly under her weight like damp cardboard. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she lay there, gasping for air that was thick with the suffocating stench of mold and decay. It coated the back of her throat, a taste of death and time. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself to her knees. The inside of the treehouse was even worse than she had imagined from the ground. Gaping holes in the roof revealed a darkening, bruised sky. Piles of damp, rotting leaves and animal droppings littered the corners, and a fine, black mildew covered every surface, a creeping plague consuming the wood. The sound of the wind was louder up here, a mournful howl that seemed to pass right through the skeletal walls. Her hope, which had been so brutally extinguished, was now replaced by a cold, practical dread. This was not a home. It was a grave waiting for a body. Getting Leo up was an exercise in pure agony. Ilara used the very rope she had just climbed, fashioning a crude harness around his small chest, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knots. She instructed him to hold on tight as she pulled, her bare feet slipping on the slick, mossy porch for purchase, every muscle straining. The sight of her son dangling 40 feet in the air, his small face pale with terror as he spun slowly below her, seared itself into her memory. A guttural animal sound of exertion and fear escaped her lips as she hauled him up, inch by agonizing inch. When he finally scrambled over the edge, he clung to her, shivering violently, burying his face in her side. She held him tightly, her own body a wreck of trembling nerves, feeling the violent thumping of his heart against her ribs. She felt a surge of maternal rage at the world, at her husband's company, at the cruel fate that had forced her to put her child through this ordeal. This place was a horror, and she had dragged him right into its center. For the first hour, they moved with the grim, determined silence of survivors. Their only goal was to secure a small corner of the ruin against the encroaching night. They shoved debris out of a gaping hole in the wall, the rotting wood crumbling in their hands. The floor was their greatest enemy. In many places, the planks were completely gone, revealing the dizzying 40-foot drop to the forest floor below. In other spots, the wood was so soft that a misplaced step could mean disaster. Ilara felt a constant low-grade terror, a humming anxiety that made every movement a calculated risk. They found a section near the main trunk of the oak, where the floor seemed slightly more solid, reinforced by the colossal tree itself. This would be their island, a tiny patch of relative safety in an ocean of decay. The cold was beginning to bite now, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped through their clothes and into their bones. Ilara's stomach twisted with a hunger so sharp it was painful, but she ignored it, focusing only on the immediate, desperate task of survival. Leo, with the resilient focus of a child, pointed to a fist-sized hole in the floorboards of their chosen corner. "We should cover that, Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "so we don't fall in our sleep." The practicality of his words struck her. He was right. In the pitch darkness of the coming night, such a hole was a hidden threat. They had one flashlight, a heavy-duty yellow one from the car's emergency kit. Ilara switched it on, its bright, clean beam cutting through the gloomy squalor of the treehouse, creating dancing, monstrous shadows on the mildewed walls. She handed it to Leo. "Hold this for me," she said, her voice strained. She began trying to pry a loose board from another part of the floor, hoping to drag it over the hole. The wood groaned in protest, splinters driving deep into her fingers. The pain was a distant, unimportant fact. The only thing that mattered was plugging this one small hole, exerting this one tiny measure of control over their terrifyingly precarious situation. It was a pathetic, desperate act of homemaking in a place that defied the very concept of home. Then it happened. As Ilara finally wrenched the board free with a loud crack, the sudden movement startled Leo. The heavy flashlight slipped from his grasp. Time seemed to slow down. Ilara watched, helpless, as the yellow cylinder hit the floor with a dull thud, rolled a few feet, and then, with a horrifying finality, disappeared straight down into the very hole they were trying to cover. A choked cry escaped Ilara's lips. Their only source of light was gone. For a heart-stopping second, they were plunged into the deepening twilight, the familiar shapes of the ruin dissolving into a murky darkness. But then a strange thing occurred. A weak, diffuse glow began to shine up from the hole. It wasn't the direct beam of the flashlight. It was an indirect, reflected light, as if the beam was pointing straight up from somewhere deep below. And in that eerie, upward-pointing light, a pattern became visible on the inner wall of the vast tree trunk that formed the back of their small shelter. A series of strange and deliberate notches, running vertically down into the darkness. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, now beat with a different, stranger rhythm. She crawled forward, ignoring the spongy give of the floorboards, her eyes fixed on the illuminated section of the tree's interior. The light from below cast the notches into sharp relief. They were not random marks of decay or insect damage. She could see that clearly now. They were uniform in size and spacing, each one a deep V-shaped cut, weathered by time but undeniably man-made. They formed a clear, unmistakable pattern, a ladder, a hidden ladder, carved into the very heart of the colossal oak tree, leading down into a darkness that had swallowed their only light. A cold shiver, entirely unrelated to the mountain air, traced its way down her spine. The oppressive, one-note feeling of despair that had crushed her for days was suddenly pierced by a single, sharp question. What was this? The stinking ruin, the overwhelming decay, the suffocating hopelessness. It all momentarily receded, replaced by the electric hum of an impossible mystery. She lay flat on her stomach, her face hovering over the dark opening. A draught of cool, strangely dry air wafted up, carrying a scent completely different from the rot that permeated the treehouse. It was the smell of dust, of deep earth and something else, a faint metallic tang like old coins. It was the scent of a place that had been sealed away from the damp and the decay, a place that had been waiting in the darkness for a very long time. Her librarian's mind, starved for order and narrative, latched onto the anomaly. This was a detail that didn't fit. A carefully carved ladder inside a tree. A dry, sealed space beneath a rotting, waterlogged structure. It was a contradiction, a secret whispered by the ancient oak. The immediate, primal fear for her and Leo's survival was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was wrapped around a burning core of curiosity. This secret felt important. It felt intentional, as if this entire place and this ruin was not the destination, but merely a decaying, forgotten lock on a hidden door, and they had just stumbled upon the key. Leo crawled over and peered down beside her, his fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a child's wide-eyed wonder. "It's a secret passage," he whispered, his voice full of the awe reserved for storybooks. His simple, fantastic declaration solidified the thought in Ilara's mind. It was a secret passage, and in their desperate, hopeless situation, a secret held a power that was almost intoxicating. It was a deviation from the miserable, predictable path they were on. It was a question mark in a story that had seemed to be ending with a brutal, definitive period. The risks were immense and obvious. The darkness below was absolute. She had no idea how deep it went or what was at the bottom. But what was the alternative? To huddle in this rotting shell, to wait for the cold and hunger to weaken them, to simply give up. The despair of the last few days had been a passive, sinking feeling. This, however, required action. It required a choice, a profound, terrifying choice between the known horror of their situation and the unknown promise of the secret hidden in the heart of the tree. The decision crystallized in her mind with a clarity that surprised her. She would go down. She had to. It was the first decision she had made since leaving the city that didn't feel like it was born of pure desperation, but of a strange, wild hope. It was a long shot, a mad gamble, but it was the only move she had left to play. "I'm going to go down there, Leo," she said, her voice more steady than she felt. "I need you to be brave and stay right here." She retrieved the damp, frayed rope she had used to haul him up, her mind racing. It was barely long enough to reach the ground from the porch. It would have to be enough to get her to the bottom of this shaft. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled as she worked, testing the strength of the old fibers, praying they would hold. She anchored one end to the most solid-looking part of the floor she could find, a thick root of the oak that protruded through the boards like a gnarled bone. Each wrap of the rope around the root was a commitment, a definitive step into the unknown. The world had shrunk to this single, focused task. Standing at the edge of the hole, Ilara felt a tremor of pure, primal fear. The darkness below was not just an absence of light. It felt like a physical presence, a cold, silent entity waiting to swallow her whole. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air from below filling her lungs. She gave the rope a final, hard tug. It held. "Talk to me the whole time, okay, Leo?" she said, her voice tight. "Just keep talking so I can hear you." He nodded, his eyes huge and dark in the gloom. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she looped the rope around her waist, gripped it tightly with both hands, and lowered herself into the abyss. The rough edges of the floorboards scraped against her back, and then she was free, dangling in the pitch black, her feet kicking in empty space. The enclosed shaft of the tree's hollow core amplified every sound, the frantic beat of her own heart, the rasp of her breath, the soft scuff of her shoes against the smooth, worn wood of the trunk's interior. It was like being lowered into a deep earthen well. The air grew cooler and drier the further she descended, the smell of damp rot from above fading away, replaced entirely by that clean, dusty scent of a place untouched by time. Her world was reduced to the feel of the rough rope sliding through her scraped palms and the sound of Leo's small voice echoing from the world above. He was chattering nervously, telling her about a character in his sketchbook, his words a fragile lifeline in the suffocating darkness. The rope burned her hands, and the muscles in her arms and back screamed with the strain of controlling her descent. She tried to slow down, to feel for the notches with her feet, but in the total blackness, she was completely disoriented. For a terrifying moment, she felt a wave of vertigo, a sense that she was falling endlessly into the center of the earth. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to focus on the sound of Leo's voice, the one point of stability in her spinning, lightless world, the feel of the rope, the sound of her son, the smell of the dust. That was all that was real. Her foot hit something solid. The impact sent a jolt up her leg. She fumbled with her feet, exploring the surface. It was a notch, a deep, solid foothold carved into the wood. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her weep washed over her. It was real. The ladder was real. She found another notch with her other foot. Her weight was no longer entirely on the rope. She was standing on the hidden ladder. Carefully, she began to climb down, her hands still clinging to the rope for safety, her feet finding each successive notch in the dark. The climb was slow and deliberate. The notches were old, the wood worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, but they were deep and secure. After about 20 feet, her foot touched not another notch, but a flat, solid surface. She had reached the bottom. She let out a shaky breath, her knees weak with relief and adrenaline. She stood in absolute silent darkness. The only sound, the faint, worried call of her son's voice from far above. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm okay, Leo," she shouted back, her own voice sounding strange and loud in the enclosed space. She untied the rope from her waist and let it fall. The silence that followed was profound, a heavy, ancient quiet that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She fumbled in her pocket for the small book of matches she'd taken from the car. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, and it took 3 tries before a match flared to life. The sudden burst of light was blinding. She held the tiny flame aloft, and its flickering glow revealed her surroundings. She was in a small circular chamber, no more than 8 feet in diameter. The walls were the smooth, hard wood of the oak's core, but the floor was made of flat, carefully laid stones. It was undeniably a man-made room, a secret cell hidden within the living tree. In the center of the chamber, she saw it, the source of the reflected light. The flashlight lay on its side, its beam pointing up the shaft, its bright, modern form an anachronism in this ancient, far secret space. The air was perfectly still, and so dry that the match burned with a steady, unwavering flame. She felt as though she had stepped out of time into a forgotten pocket of history. Her gaze swept across the chamber, her heart pounding. The room was empty, save for one object. Against the far wall, sitting on the stone floor, was a heavy, dark chest. It was about 3 feet long, bound with thick bands of rusted iron and studded with large, dark nail heads. It was not a simple wooden box. It was a coffer, a strong box, built to protect something of immense value. A thick layer of dust covered its surface, but beneath it, she could just make out a dark, grayish metal lining peeking through a crack in the lid. Lead. It was lined with lead. The sight of it sent a new jolt of adrenaline through her. This was not a random discovery. The hidden ladder, the secret room, and now this formidable chest. It was a deliberate chain of secrets, each one leading to the next. The match flickered and died, plunging her back into darkness. She quickly lit another, her hands trembling, and made her way to the chest. The air of mystery in the small room was so thick it was almost tangible. She knelt before the chest, the tiny flame casting her own giant, dancing shadow against the curved wall behind her. The chest was locked with a large, ornate iron lock, rusted solid by the passage of time. There was no key. For a moment, despair threatened to return. To have come this far, to have found this incredible secret. only to be thwarted by a simple lock seemed like the cruelest joke of all. But then a surge of stubborn resolve hardened within her. She would not be stopped now. She looked around the small chamber, her matchlight flickering, and her eyes landed on one of the loose floor stones near the wall. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. Letting the match die, she worked in the dark, her fingers finding the edges of the stone, prying it loose from the hard-packed earth beneath. It was heavy, but she managed to lift it. Hoisting the stone above her head, she brought it down with all her might on the rusted lock. The sound of the impact was deafening in the tiny chamber, a brutal, metallic clang that vibrated through the floor. She struck it again and again, a frantic, desperate energy seizing her. A piece of rusted metal flew off, striking the wall. On the fifth blow, there was a loud crack, and the locking mechanism shattered. The lid of the chest, no longer held shut, bounced open an inch with a low, mournful creak. She dropped the stone, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands stinging. For a long moment, she just knelt there in the dark, her heart hammering. She was afraid to look. The possibilities of what lay inside were so immense, so terrifying, that they threatened to overwhelm her. She lit her last match. The flame sputtered, then steadied. With a trembling hand, she reached out and slowly, reverently lifted the heavy lid. The matchlight fell inside, and Ilara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, audible gasp that was swallowed by the silent chamber. Gold. The interior of the chest was filled, almost to the brim, with the soft, unmistakable gleam of gold coins. They were dark with age and tarnish, but they were undeniably gold. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, piled loosely, spilling over each other. It was a pirate's treasure, a fairy tale hoard, an impossible, life-altering fortune sitting in a secret room at the bottom of a tree. A single, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. The sound was alien and jarring in the silent tomb. It was the sound of a mind breaking, or perhaps of a mind being saved. This was it. This was the answer. It was freedom. It was a future for Leo. It was enough money to escape this nightmare, to start over, to live, to breathe again. The weight of the eviction notice, the paltry settlement check, the gnawing hunger, it all seemed to evaporate in the warm, gentle glow of the gold. Tears streamed down her face. But these were not the silent, wan, hopeless tears of before. These were tears of shock, of disbelief, of a deliverance so profound it felt like a dream. She reached in and let a handful of the heavy coins run through her fingers. The feel of the cool, solid metal was the most real thing she had felt in months. It was a tangible, physical end to her suffering. The match burned down, searing her fingertips, and she dropped it, plunging herself back into darkness. But the darkness was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the radiant, golden memory of salvation. She found the flashlight, its beam still strong, and aimed it back into the chest. The steady, white light revealed more detail than the flickering match. She could see now that the coins were not all loose. Many were wrapped in small, tight bundles of dark, oil-stained cloth. A practical detail, perhaps to keep them from rattling. She reached for one of the bundles, her curiosity piqued. It was heavier than it looked, and the cloth was stiff and brittle with age. As she picked it up, the fabric, weakened by time, began to crumble in her fingers. Something else was inside, wrapped with the coins. Paper. Carefully folded sheets of old yellowed paper. She gently worked the crumbling oilcloth away, her heart beginning to pound with a new, different kind of anticipation. The gold was a simple, brutal answer to her problems, but the papers were a question. Why wrap documents in oilcloth and hide them with a fortune? Why go to such lengths to preserve them? A new layer of mystery was unfolding. The treasure was not just the gold. With painstaking care, Ilara unfolded the first brittle sheet. It was a legal document, a deed of some kind, the script written in an elegant, looping hand that was difficult to read in the shifting flashlight beam. The date at the top read 1854. Another paper was a sworn affidavit, its language formal and stark. But it was the third item in the bundle that made her blood run cold. It was not a legal document. It was a small, leather-bound book, no bigger than her hand. A diary. She opened it to a random page. The ink was faded, a rusty brown against the yellowed paper, but the words were clear, and they leaped out at her, charged with a desperate, secret energy. "Another soul passed through tonight," she read, her voice a whispered breath in the silent room. "A family of 4, their fear a palpable thing in the dark. The gold is a necessity, but a poor substitute for true justice. Vandergrift's men ride the paths every night. They suspect, may God protect this house in the trees and the secrets it keeps." Vandergrift. The name was a thunderclap in the tiny enclosed space. The gold coin suddenly felt cold and heavy in her lap. The simple, joyous solution of the treasure was rapidly dissolving, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. Vandergrift. The name was everywhere back in the city. Vandergrift Logging. Vandergrift Philanthropies. The very company that had sent her a pittance for her husband's life. The connection was impossible, a coincidence too vast to be believed, and yet here it was. Written in faded brown ink from over a century and a half ago. She felt a profound and sudden chill, a deep internal cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the chamber. This was not a fairy tale treasure. This was not a pirate's hoard. This was something else entirely. It was a secret history, a dangerous legacy, a story of injustice that had been deliberately buried, sealed away in the heart of a giant tree, waiting. She looked at the gold, then at the diary in her hands. She had descended into this tree seeking a refuge from her miserable life, and had instead found the dark, tangled root of it. The discovery of the gold had felt like an ending, but she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that this was just the beginning. The flashlight beam shook in Ilara's trembling hand, its stark white light painting the ancient words in harsh relief. She spent what felt like hours in the cold, silent chamber, a prisoner of a history she never knew existed. The diary belonged to a man named Jedediah Thorne, an abolitionist preacher who had used this treehouse, this impossible refuge, as a vital stop on the Underground Railroad. The words on the page were not dry history. They were alive with terror and hope. She could almost hear the whispered prayers in the dark, feel the chilling fear of the families who had hidden in this very spot, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. Her own despair, which had felt so absolute, now seemed small and personal compared to this epic struggle for human freedom. The gold was not a treasure hoard, it was a liberation fund, each coin representing a life purchased from the hell of bondage. A profound sense of awe and responsibility settled over her, chilling her to the bone. The air in the chamber felt thick with the ghosts of those who had passed through. The name Vandergrift was a poison staining the pages. Jedediah wrote of them with a mixture of fear and contempt. The original patriarch, a man named Colonel Alistair Vandergrift, was a brute masquerading as a gentleman. The diaries, cross-referenced with the sworn affidavits from other abolitionists, painted a picture of unimaginable evil. The Vandergrifts and their hired thugs didn't just oppose the Underground Railroad, they actively hunted it. They were not just slave owners, they were predators. Ilara felt a wave of nausea so powerful she had to brace herself against the curved wooden wall. The documents were a meticulous record of their crimes, a ledger of murder. They detailed how Vandergrift's men would track fugitives to safe houses like this one, slaughtering not only the escaped slaves, but the abolitionists who helped them. The injustice was so profound, so ancient and yet so raw, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. The true horror, the secret to their dynastic wealth, was laid bare in a set of land deeds and financial records wrapped in a separate oilcloth bundle. After murdering Jedediah Thorne and his compatriots, the Vandergrifts had forged documents, seizing their lands under the guise of abandoned property. The gold, the Liberation Fund, was stolen and became the seed money for their empire. But the final, most sickening revelation made Ilara's blood run cold. They had discovered that some of the people they captured were already legally freed individuals, traveling north to join their families. The Vandergrifts, with a level of cynical evil that defied comprehension, destroyed their freedom papers and sold them back into slavery in a different state. A crime so heinous it was almost unthinkable. The entire Vandergrift fortune, the philanthropic donations, the gleaming skyscrapers in the city, it was all built on a foundation of stolen land, stolen gold, and stolen lives. The sheer scale of the deception was dizzying. Ilara finally climbed out of the tree's hollow core as the first weak grey light of dawn filtered through the skeletal branches. She was no longer the same woman who had descended into the darkness, the hopeless. A grieving widow had been replaced by something else, something harder and more dangerous, a witness. She clutched the lead-lined chest, its weight both a terrible burden and a source of strange, cold strength. Sleep was an impossible luxury. She sat on the rotting porch, the chest beside her, watching the forest slowly awaken, her mind racing. The sounds of the woods were no longer just a backdrop of nature. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, was a potential threat. Her husband's death was no longer a random, tragic accident. The word echoed in her mind, a bitter mockery. He had been a logger. He had worked for Vandergrift. Had he found something? A clue? Had he stumbled upon this place, this secret, and paid for it with his life? The certainty of it settled in her soul with the cold, heavy finality of a tombstone. The sound was alien in the primordial silence of the woods. It was the crunch of tires on gravel and dirt, a sound that did not belong here. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat, a wild, panicked bird beating against her ribs. She scrambled to shove the chest into the darkest corner of the treehouse, covering it with a pile of damp and rotting leaves, her hands shaking violently. She peered through a gap in the wall. A sleek, black sedan, its paint gleaming even in the dull morning light, was parked behind her own rusted, pathetic car. It was a vehicle of immense power and wealth, an invader from another world. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a fine wool coat and polished leather shoes that seemed to scorn the mud and decay of the clearing. He was old, perhaps 75, with a mane of perfectly white hair, but he stood with the ramrod straight posture of a military man. Her breath caught. Even from this distance, he was instantly recognizable from countless newspaper articles and charity galas. It was Silas Vandergrift. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his gaze sweeping across the clearing, taking in the scene with an air of absolute ownership. He looked at her broken-down car with a faint, dismissive sneer. Then his eyes lifted, locking directly onto the treehouse. Ilara felt a jolt, as if he could see her through the rotting planks. It was the predatory gaze of a hawk that has spotted its prey. There was no surprise on his face, only a cold, calculated assessment. He knew. He had known she would come here. The thought was a spear of ice through her gut. This wasn't a chance encounter. He had been waiting, or he had been watching. A second man, larger and thicker, got out of the passenger side, his posture that of a bodyguard, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Ilara shrank back from the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was afraid he would hear it. The smell of mold in the treehouse felt suffocating, trapping her. She was 40 feet up in a rotten box with no escape, and the monster from the diaries had just appeared at her door. Mrs. Hayes, his voice boomed across the clearing, startling a flock of crows from the surrounding trees. The sound was rich and powerful, cultivated by years of authority. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed. "Ilara Hayes, I know you're up there. I'm Silas Vandergrift. I'd like to have a word with you, if I may." His tone was deceptively civil, the polite request of a friendly neighbor, but underneath it, she could hear a resonant thrum of command, an iron will that would not be denied. Her mind reeled. How could she face him? How could she pretend she didn't know the litany of horrors his family was responsible for? How could she look into the face of the man who had almost certainly ordered her husband's murder? A tremor of pure, unadulterated fear ran through her. She felt like a mouse trapped in a cage, watching the calm, patient eyes of the snake that had come to devour it. Silence was not an option. It would be an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that she was hiding. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara forced her trembling legs to move. She stepped out onto the sagging porch, clinging to the main trunk of the oak for support, her knuckles white. She looked down at him. He stood directly below, his head tilted back, a thin, polished smile on his lips. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They were chips of cold blue ice, and they were studying her with an unnerving intensity, trying to read her, to gauge what she knew. "Mr. Vandergrift," she managed to say, her voice a strained, reedy thing that was barely audible over the sighing of the wind. She felt impossibly high and exposed, a target pinned against the sky. The power imbalance was nauseating. He was rooted to the earth, solid and powerful in his expensive coat, while she was perched precariously in a swaying, rotting ruin, a desperate refugee clad in dirty, worn-out clothes. The contrast was a deliberate demonstration of his dominance, a silent statement of who held all the cards. "My apologies for intruding," he said, the smile never wavering. "My company owns much of the surrounding timberland, and when my lawyers noted the old Hayes deed had been activated, I felt a neighborly and historical obligation to come and see for myself." The word historical hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was telling her, without saying it, that he knew exactly what this land represented. He gestured around the clearing with a dismissive wave of his hand. "As you can see, this place is a complete ruin. The land is worthless, impossible to build on. And this tree, magnificent as it is, it's ancient, unstable. It's a tragedy, waiting to happen." Every word was carefully chosen, a sharpened dart aimed directly at her. He wasn't just talking about the tree, he was talking about her situation, about her presence here. He was defining her reality for her. She was in danger, and the place she had run to was not a sanctuary but a trap. He took a few steps closer to the base of the tree, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. "I am a sentimental man, Mrs. Hayes. This particular plot has been a point of interest for my family for generations, a small piece of a puzzle we've long sought to complete." The confession was startling in its candor. He wasn't even pretending anymore. He was openly admitting his search, his hunt. "For that reason, and out of concern for you and your son's safety, I am prepared to make you a generous offer to purchase this land from you. Far more than it's worth. Enough to allow you and your boy to start a new life as somewhere safe, somewhere far away from here." The offer hung in the air, a poisoned apple. It was the price of her silence. It was the cost of the evidence hidden just a few feet away from her. The gold in the chest was a fortune, but the money he was offering was a different kind of currency, an escape, bought with a lie. Ilara's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. The practical part of her, the terrified mother, screamed to take the deal, take the money, take Leo and run, disappear. Forget the diaries, the murders, the stolen lives. Her husband was gone. Nothing could bring him back. Her duty was to her living son, to his survival. But another part of her, the librarian who believed in the power of truth, the widow whose husband was murdered by this man's greed, the woman who had held a century of injustice in her hands, rebelled. The faces of the people described in Jedediah's diary flashed in her mind. To take this money would be to become complicit in their erasure. It would be to spit on Jedediah's sacrifice and to validate the Vandergrift legacy of violence. She felt her heart constrict in her chest, a painful, tearing choice. She said nothing, her silence her only weapon, her only refusal. Silas Vandergrift's smile finally faltered. A flicker of cold annoyance crossed his features. Her silence was not the response he had expected. He had offered her the easy way out, and she had not taken it. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost its neighborly warmth. It was flat, hard, and laced with chilling menace. "This is a very dangerous place, Mrs. Hayes. The woods are unpredictable. The stability of an old tree like this can never be guaranteed." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked from the massive trunk of the oak directly into her eyes, and the final unspoken link between past and present clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "Tragic accidents happen out here all the time," he said softly, his voice a blade of ice. "Things fall, equipment malfunctions, just like the unfortunate accident that befell your husband." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a stark and brutal declaration. He had just confessed to her husband's murder and promised her the same fate. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood drained from Ilara's face, and she felt a wave of dizziness so intense she had to grip the tree trunk to keep from falling. The air was thin and cold, and she couldn't seem to draw a full breath. He knew. He knew she had the documents, or he suspected she was close enough to be a threat that had to be eliminated. Her husband hadn't just stumbled upon a secret, he had been executed for it, and now the executioner was standing below her, giving her a final, chilling ultimatum: take the money and disappear or join her husband. The sound of the wind howling through the branches sounded like a scream. Leo was inside, just a few feet away, completely oblivious to the mortal danger they were in. Her protective instincts screamed, a silent primal roar in her mind. The man below her was not just a historical monster. He was a clear and present danger, a killer who would stop at nothing to protect his family's dark legacy. He gave a slight, formal nod, his point made. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. He will contact you in a day or two. I do hope you'll make the wise decision, for your son's sake." With that, he turned his back on her, his posture radiating absolute confidence in the outcome. He walked back to his gleaming black car, his bodyguard holding the door open for him. The engine started with a low, powerful purr that was obscene in the quiet clearing. As the car pulled away, disappearing back down the overgrown track, it left behind a silence that was more terrifying than the threat itself. Ilara was left alone on the rotting porch, her body trembling, her mind shattered. She was caught between an impossible choice, a fortune built on blood, or a truth that would almost certainly get her and her son killed. The weight of the lead-lined chest felt like it was pulling the entire treehouse down around her. She was trapped, 40 feet in the air, in a rotting shack with no car, no phone, and no one in the world knowing where she was. The only person who knew her location was the man who had just threatened to kill her. The choice he had given her was a lie. He would never let her live, not with what she now knew. The money was a diversion, a way to buy himself time. The evidence in the chest was a death sentence. To reveal it was to declare war on a man who had been winning that war for his entire life. To keep it hidden was to simply wait for his men to return in the dead of night. What would you do in her place? Would you take the slim chance that the money offered a real escape, burning the evidence to save your child? Or would you clutch that evidence, that proof of unimaginable evil, and fight for a justice that seemed utterly impossible, knowing it could be the last thing you ever do? The silence left behind by the black sedan was more menacing than Silas Vandergrift's voice. The wind, which had been a mournful sigh, now sounded like a hiss, whispering threats through the skeletal branches of the great oak. Every nerve in her body was screaming, a high-pitched frequency of pure terror that drowned out all other thought. Vandergrift's final words echoed in her mind, a death sentence delivered with the casual politeness of a business transaction. Tragic accidents happen. The memory of her husband's funeral, the feel of the cold, hard earth on her hands as she dropped the first handful of dirt, flooded her with a grief so sharp it was physically painful. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled down her temples. She was not just a widow. She was the widow of a murdered man. And his killer now knew exactly where she and her son were. The isolation of the clearing was no longer a symbol of destitution. It was a tomb designed just for them. Leo came out of the treehouse, his small face pale and worried. "Is he gone, Mom?" he asked, his voice a fragile thread in the heavy silence. Ilara forced herself to turn, to compose her features into a mask of calm she was nowhere near feeling. The lie was a bitter acid in her throat. "Yes, honey. He's gone." She knelt and pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair, inhaling the innocent scent of her child. The warmth of his small body was an anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. She could feel the violent hammering of her own heart against his back, and prayed he couldn't sense her terror. The weight of the lead-lined chest, hidden just a few feet away, felt like a physical presence beside them. It was a promise of justice, yes, but it was also a magnet for death. Vandergrift's offer of money was a phantom, a cruel illusion. He would never let her walk away with the knowledge she possessed. He had come here to gauge her, to confirm his suspicions. Now that he had, his next visit would not be for conversation. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western sky in bloody streaks of orange and crimson. The shadows of the surrounding trees grew long and distorted, stretching like dark, grasping fingers across the clearing toward the great oak. With the fading light came a new, more primal fear. The approaching night was no longer just a source of cold. It was a shroud, a collaborator for the evil that was surely coming for them. A profound sense of helplessness washed over Ilara, so powerful it made her knees weak. They were trapped. The car was dead. They were miles from any road, lost in a wilderness that belonged to their enemy. She ran through the impossible options in her mind. Could they flee into the woods? They would be lost in minutes, succumbing to the cold or predators, animal or human. Could she hide the chest and pretend she knew nothing? It was too late. Her silence in the face of his threat had been her answer. She had defied him, and Silas Vandergrift was not a man who tolerated defiance. A sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible beneath the sighing of the wind, but it was enough to make Ilara's blood turn to ice. The snap of a dry twig. Her head whipped toward the tree line, her body instantly rigid, every muscle coiled tight. He was back. They were back. The thought was a white-hot flash of panic. She shoved Leo behind her, her body forming a fragile, desperate shield. "Get inside," she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Hide. Don't make a sound." She scanned the deepening shadows, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She expected to see the hulking forms of Vandergrift's men, to see the glint of metal in the dying light. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the silence punctuated only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic pulse beating in her ears. The forest held its breath, a silent, watchful witness to her terror. She was utterly exposed, a cornered animal waiting for the final, lethal blow to land and end everything. From the dense thicket of mountain laurel at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was not the hulking bodyguard or a team of thugs. It was a single man, old and stooped, moving with a slow, careful gait. He leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick, and his clothes, worn flannel and patched denim, seemed to be of the same earthen time as the woods themselves. His face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles, his skin weathered like old leather, and a fringe of wispy white hair peeked out from under a faded wool cap. He stopped just inside the clearing, his gaze not on Ilara, but on the black tire tracks left by Vandergrift's sedan. His eyes, when he finally lifted them to her, were not threatening. They were a pale, faded blue, and they held a weariness so profound it seemed to contain generations of sorrow. He looked at her, then at Leo peeking out from behind her, and a deep, sad sigh escaped his lips. They sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement on a lonely street. Ilara's fear did not subside, it simply changed its shape. The immediate terror of imminent violence was replaced by a sharp, piercing suspicion. Who was this man, in this place, where every shadow held a threat? A stranger was not a potential rescuer. He was another variable in a deadly equation. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. She took a step forward, positioning herself directly between the man and the rope ladder that led to her son and the secret in the chest. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy tire iron she'd pulled from the car's trunk earlier, its cold, solid weight a pathetic comfort against the coming storm. The old man held up a hand, his palm open, a universal gesture of peace. "No need for that, miss," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly gentle. "I ain't here to cause you harm. Name's Abel. My cabin's just over that ridge." He gestured with his chin. "I saw the fancy car, figured it was him, figured it was time." Time for what? The question hung in the frigid air between them. Abel's gaze drifted from Ilara's tense face up to the colossal oak, and his expression softened into one of deep, painful reverence. He wasn't looking at a rotting shack, he was looking at a shrine. "I've been watching this place my whole life," he murmured, his voice laced with a strange intimacy, as if he were speaking to an old friend. "My father before me, and his father before him." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound sorrow. "They finally found you," he whispered, the words not directed at Ilara, but at the tree itself, at the spirit that lived within its ancient wood. Ilara's heart gave a painful lurch. He knew. This strange, weathered man who had appeared from the woods like a ghost knew the secret. The complex web of fear and confusion that had ensnared her for the past day was suddenly illuminated by a shocking, impossible new light. He was not a threat. He was something else entirely. He was a part of this buried story. He lowered his gaze from the tree and met her eyes, and in their pale blue depths, she saw a shared history she didn't yet understand. "That black car belongs to Silas Vandergrift," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "He doesn't come calling for neighborly chats. If he came to you, it means he knows you're close, or that you've already found it." The "it" was unspoken, but Ilara knew exactly what he meant. The chest, the diaries, the truth. A shudder ran through her, a tremor of shock that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who?" "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. Abel leaned on his walking stick, the wood creaking under his weight. "I'm the reason that story is still here to be found," he said simply. "My family. We're the guardians. We've been watching over Jedediah's rest for 150 years, waiting for someone like you, an heir to the cause." The words Jedediah's rest hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was the name from the diary. Ilara felt the strength leave her legs, and she had to lean against the massive trunk of the oak for support. The world was tilting, rearranging itself around this old man's quiet words. Guardians, Jedediah's rest. These were concepts from a fantasy novel, not from her shattered reality. Abel seemed to understand her shock. He took a slow step closer, his presence no longer threatening, but strangely comforting, like an old, familiar landmark in a terrifyingly new landscape. "My great-great-grandfather was a man named Isaac," he said, his voice soft with memory. "He and his family were some of the last souls Jedediah Thorne helped guide to freedom through this very tree. They were meant to head north, but after the massacre, after Vandergrift's men killed Jedediah, my family stayed, hidden in these hills. We made a promise, to watch the tree, to protect the truth sealed inside it, to wait for someone who could finally bring it into the light." His story was a key, unlocking a door in her mind she didn't even know was there. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with dizzying speed. Her great-great-uncle, the man who had left her this worthless land, he wasn't some eccentric stranger. He was part of it. "He tried," Abel confirmed, seeing the question in her eyes. "Your uncle, he knew the stories. He came here 30 years ago, tried to get the deed recognized, to get access. But the Vandergrifts have owned the courts and the county offices for a century. They stonewalled him, threatened him. He grew old and gave up. But he never sold. He kept the deed, passed it down, hoping one day another would come." Ilara's mind reeled. Her entire life, this secret history had been running like a silent river beneath the surface of her world, and she had never known the weight of that legacy, of Jedediah's sacrifice, and Abel's family's long, lonely vigil, settled upon her shoulders. She was not just a desperate woman who had stumbled upon a treasure. She was the culmination of a promise made across generations. The thought was both terrifying and strangely empowering. She had to know. The question that had been a burning coal in her heart now had to be spoken aloud. "My husband," she began, her voice cracking with the effort of saying the words. "He worked for Vandergrift Logging. He died in an accident." Abel's kind face hardened, the weary sadness in his eyes replaced by a flash of cold, ancient anger. He looked away from her, toward the darkening woods, his jaw tight. "Wasn't no accident," he said, his voice a low, hard growl. The 3 words landed like stones in the pit of her stomach. She had known it, felt it in her bones, but hearing it spoken as an undeniable truth was like having a wound ripped open anew. "Your husband was a good man, an honest man. Too honest for the likes of Vandergrift. He was a foreman. He found things in the old company logging routes, discrepancies in the old survey maps, mentions of this land. He started asking questions, quietly, but the wrong people heard him. The confirmation was a brutal, physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Ilara slid down the trunk of the tree, her legs giving out completely. She sat on the cold, damp earth, a choked sob escaping her lips. The image of her husband's smiling face flashed in her mind, and for the first time, the grief was not a soft, aching sorrow, but a white-hot, blinding rage. He hadn't died because of a faulty machine or a moment of carelessness. He had been murdered for his curiosity. He had been silenced because he got too close to the truth she now held in a lead-lined chest just above her head. The injustice of it was a physical poison, flooding her system, making her shake with a fury so intense it eclipsed her fear. Silas Vandergrift hadn't just taken her husband's future. He had stolen his past, rebranding his murder as a simple, tragic mishap. He had reduced a brave, inquisitive man to a line item in a financial settlement. The hot tears that streamed down her face were no longer tears of despair, but tears of pure, unadulterated hatred for the man in the sleek black car. Abel let her grieve for a moment, his silence a respectful testament to a sorrow he and his family knew all too well. "Vandergrift's evil is a sickness in these hills, passed down from father to son," he said, his voice grim. They've been hunting for Jedediah's ledger for 150 years. They know the stories. They know the proof of their crimes is out there somewhere. This tree is the last place they haven't been able to touch. He looked up at the darkening silhouette of the treehouse against the bruised twilight sky. That structure up there ain't just a house. It's a library of their sins. And now that he knows you're here, now that he suspects you've found the reading room, he's not going to make an offer. He's coming to burn the library down. With the librarian and her son still inside, the metaphor was chillingly precise. It stripped away all illusion. The threat was no longer a matter of if, but when. And when was coming very, very soon. The wind picked up, howling through the branches like a chorus of warning ghosts. Hope, a feeling she thought had been extinguished forever, sparked anew, but it was a desperate, frantic kind of hope. "The chest," Ilara said, scrambling to her feet. "The documents are the diaries. It's all in there. It's proof. We can take it to the police, to the newspapers." Abel shook his head, his expression grim. "What police? The county sheriff is in Vandergrift's pocket, always has been. The nearest state barracks is 50 miles away, and you have no car and no phone. You'd never make it off this mountain alive. They control everything here." His words were a bucket of ice water, dousing the flame of her newfound hope. They were on an island, surrounded by a sea of corruption that was generations deep. There was no authority to appeal to, no cavalry to call. The law, justice, society, all the things she had once believed in, were meaningless concepts here. Here, the only law was the law of the Vandergrift family, and the only justice was the brutal, final justice they dispensed to their enemies. "Then what do we do?" Ilara cried, her voice cracking with desperation. The brief surge of rage had been replaced again by the cold, sharp talons of fear. For the first time, Abel's weathered face broke into a thin, grim smile. "We don't play by his rules," he said, tapping the base of the colossal oak with his walking stick. Jedediah Thorne was a clever man. He knew a fortress needed more than one way out. He knelt down, his old joints groaning in protest, and began scraping away the thick layer of moss and damp earth at the base of the tree, on the side hidden from the clearing. "For 150 years, the Vandergrifts have been looking up," he grunted, his hands digging into the dirt. "They never thought to look down." He revealed a large, flat stone, almost perfectly flush with the ground, a dark ring of iron set into its center. Jedediah dug a tunnel. "It connects the chamber at the bottom of the tree's core to the root cellar under my cabin. It's how my family escaped the massacre, and it's how you're going to escape tonight." The revelation was so sudden, so fantastic, that Ilara could only stare, dumbfounded. A secret tunnel. It was another detail from a child's adventure story, yet here it was, a tangible promise of escape, revealed by a guardian in the twilight. But there was no time for wonder. From far down the mountain, a new sound reached them, cutting through the wind. It was not the purr of a luxury sedan. It was a deeper, more guttural sound, the angry, grinding roar of heavy-duty engines, laboring up the steep, muddy track. Abel froze, his head cocked, listening. "They're here," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion, flat and final. He didn't even wait for full dark. The sound grew louder, closer, resolving itself into the distinct sound of two separate trucks. There was no more time for planning, no more time for talk. The climax had arrived, roaring up the mountain to meet them. A primal, animal terror seized Ilara, and she scrambled for the rope ladder. Her only thought to get to Leo, headlights sliced through the trees, sweeping across the clearing like prison searchlights. Two large, battered pickup trucks, caked in mud and rust, roared into the clearing and shuddered to a stop, their engines idling with a menacing rumble. The high beams pinned the great oak in a harsh, unforgiving glare, turning the ruin into a stark, skeletal horror show. The doors flew open and 4 men spilled out. They were not dressed in suits. They wore dirty jeans and heavy work boots, their faces grim and shadowed under the brims of their baseball caps. They moved with a brutal efficiency, their actions devoid of hesitation. One of them immediately started pulling a large, red gasoline can from the truck bed. Another hefted a thick coil of chain, and 2 of them, with a chilling sense of purpose, pulled out chainsaws, their long blades glinting in the truck's headlights. They were not here to threaten or negotiate. They were a demolition crew, sent to do a job. The air, already cold, seemed to drop another 20 degrees. The sight of the chainsaws sent a shockwave of pure, undiluted terror through Ilara's system. The sound of the idling engines was a low growl, the promise of the violence to come. One of the men, a large bearded figure who seemed to be the leader, barked an order. "Let's get it done. He wants it gone by midnight. Trunk, branches, everything. Turn it into sawdust and ash." His voice was rough, completely indifferent. The voice of a man carrying out a routine, unpleasant chore. There was no malice in it, which was somehow more terrifying than if he had been screaming threats. This was just a job. The job was to destroy this tree and everything, and everyone in it. Ilara's breath hitched in a silent, strangled sob. This was real. The abstract danger had materialized into 4 men, 2 chainsaws, and a can of gasoline. Her mind struggled to process the sheer, brutal finality of their intent. They were going to cut her world down around her. "The chest!" Abel's voice was a sharp command cutting through her paralysis. "Get the chest! Now! Go!" His urgency propelled her into motion. She scrambled up the rope ladder, her hands and feet finding the holds by sheer muscle memory. The porch creaked and groaned under her frantic weight. She burst into the dark, stinking interior of the treehouse. "Leo!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. He was huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror, staring at the blinding headlights that filled the space. She didn't have time to comfort him. She grabbed the lead-lined chest, its weight a dead, unforgiving anchor. She grunted with the effort, her muscles straining as she dragged it across the soft, rotting floorboards. It was impossibly heavy, the weight of history, of justice, and of her own survival, all concentrated into one dark, iron-bound box. Every second felt like an hour, the sound of the truck engines a constant, throbbing drumbeat of doom on the edge of her hearing. Down the rope! Ilara! Now! Abel was at the base of the tree, his voice a desperate, urgent plea. She dragged the chest to the hole in the floor, the opening to the tree's secret core. There was no way to climb down the ladder and carry the chest at the same time. The rope. It was their only hope. She tied the end of the fraying rope around the chest's iron handle, her fingers numb and clumsy with haste. Outside, she heard the sharp metallic sound of the chainsaw's pull cord being yanked. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life with a deafening, monstrous scream. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, through the very air she breathed, a visceral, physical assault. It was the sound of imminent destruction. The entire tree seemed to tremble with the noise. Leo let out a terrified cry, and Ilara grabbed him, pushing him toward the hole. "You have to go down, honey. Abel is at the bottom. Just slide down the rope. I'm right behind you." She lowered Leo into the dark shaft first, his small, trembling body disappearing into the abyss. Then she began to lower the chest. It was a dead weight, pulling ferociously, the old rope groaning under the strain, its fibers stretching and snapping. Her hands burned as the rope slid through them, stripping the skin from her palms. The chainsaw's roar was joined by a second, its high-pitched scream harmonizing into a symphony of destruction. Then came a new sound, a sickening, tearing crunch as the first blade bit into the living wood of the great oak's trunk. The entire tree shuddered violently, a deep, groaning tremor that felt like an earthquake. A shower of wood chips and dust rained down into the shaft. Ilara lost her grip for a second, the rope sliding free, and the chest plummeted the last few feet, landing with a heavy, muffled thud in the chamber below. Without a second's hesitation, she swung herself into the hole and slid down the rope, landing in a heap beside Abel and her son. They were in the secret chamber, the roar of the chainsaws now slightly muffled, but still terrifyingly loud, a constant, grinding vibration that shook the stone floor beneath their feet. Abel was already at the far wall, heaving at a section of the stone floor that Ilara hadn't noticed before. It was the entrance to the tunnel. With a final grunt of effort, he lifted a large flagstone, revealing a dark, square opening in the earth. A wave of cool, musty air, the smell of damp soil and deep roots, washed over them. It was the smell of escape. "Quickly," Abel urged, shining a small, battery-powered lantern into the darkness. "The tunnel is narrow. Stay low." The tree gave another violent shudder, more powerful this time. A loud crack, like a rifle shot, echoed from above. The sound of splintering, tearing wood was followed by a tremendous crash as one of the massive lower branches was severed and fell to the forest floor. The men outside cheered, their voices faint but triumphant. Ilara crawled into the tunnel first, shoving the chest ahead of her. The passage was impossibly tight, a claustrophobic earthen tube barely wide enough for her shoulders. The ground was cold and damp, and the tangled roots of the great oak protruded from the walls and ceiling, grabbing at her clothes like skeletal fingers. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. The chest was a nightmare, its sharp corners digging into the dirt, catching on every root. She pushed and dragged, her muscles screaming, her raw palms leaving bloody smears on the iron bands. Leo scrambled in behind her, his whimpering sobs echoing in the enclosed space. Abel followed last, pulling the stone slab partially closed behind them, plunging them into a deeper, more profound darkness, broken only by the weak, swinging beam of his lantern. The sounds of the chainsaws were duller now, but the vibrations in the earth around them were more intense than ever. They were inside the body of the beast as it was being slain, and they could feel every blow. The air in the tunnel was thick and hard to breathe, heavy with the scent of a century of stillness. It was the smell of earth, of stone, of a place that had not seen the light of day since the Civil War. Ilara pushed onward, her movements frantic and clumsy in the dark. The only reality was the suffocating closeness of the tunnel walls, the dead weight of the chest, and the terrifying vibrations that shook the ground around them. She could feel the tree dying. It wasn't just a sound or a vibration. It was a feeling, a deep, groaning agony that seemed to travel through the very roots that surrounded her. The chainsaws stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise. It was a silence filled with anticipation. Ilara froze, her heart hammering. What were they doing? Then she heard their shouts, muffled by the tons of earth above them, and then a new smell drifted down the shaft and into the tunnel, a sharp, acrid chemical stench that made her stomach heave. Gasoline. "They're going to burn it," Abel breathed from behind her, his voice tight with horror. "To cover their tracks, to make sure nothing survives. Move!" The new threat gave Ilara a fresh surge of adrenaline. The fire. They were trapped in a tunnel connected to a giant, gasoline-soaked pyre. The image of the flames roaring down the hollow shaft, consuming the oxygen, turning their narrow escape route into a tomb, flashed in her mind. She pushed the chest with a desperate, guttural cry, ignoring the pain in her hands and the burning in her lungs. She could hear Leo crying behind her, a thin, terrified sound. "It's okay, baby. We're almost there," she lied, her voice a raw, unconvincing rasp. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a dark, earthen throat that had swallowed them whole. The smell of gasoline was stronger now, a sickening perfume that heralded their doom. She didn't just smell it. She could taste the foul chemicals on the back of her tongue. A tremendous, soul-shaking groan echoed through the tunnel, a sound of colossal failure. The entire tree was shifting, its massive weight settling as its base was eaten away by the saws. The ground beneath Ilara trembled violently, and dirt rained down from the ceiling of the tunnel. A loud, sharp crack, like a clap of thunder directly overhead, reverberated through the passage. It was the sound of the tree's heartwood, its central pillar of strength for centuries, finally splitting apart. Leo screamed, a pure, piercing shriek of terror that was abruptly cut off. Ilara risked a glance back. A section of the tunnel roof, destabilized by the shift, had partially collapsed, dirt and rocks blocking the path. Abel was shielded by the slight bend in the tunnel, but Leo was half buried, pinned by the dirt. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Ilara. She clawed her way backward, digging at the loose earth with her bloody hands, her mind a white noise of terror. "Leo, he's okay, his legs are just caught," Abel yelled, his voice strained. "Keep going, get the chest out, I'll get him." The logic of his command was brutal and undeniable. The chest was the reason for all of this. It was the evidence. It was their only weapon. To abandon it now would be to render her husband's death, Jedediah's sacrifice, and this entire nightmare utterly meaningless. Torn between her maternal instinct to stay and the cold, hard necessity of the mission, Ilara hesitated for only a heartbeat. She gave a single, agonized sob, then turned and began pushing the chest again, her movements now fueled by a desperate, Ferocious rage. She was no longer just fleeing, she was fighting. Every inch she gained with the chest was an act of defiance. Outside, a new sound began, a low, hungry whoosh followed by a deep roar. The fire had been lit. A faint, flickering orange glow began to illuminate the dust motes in the tunnel behind them. The fire was coming for them. A dim, square shape of light appeared ahead. The end of the tunnel. It was a small, wooden hatch. The exit into Abel's root cellar. With a final desperate surge of strength, Ilara shoved the chest forward until it hit the base of the cellar stairs. She scrambled past it, her hands finding the rough wood of the hatch. It was heavy, swollen with damp. She pushed with all her might. It didn't budge. Panic seized her again. Trapped. They were trapped at the very end. She could hear Abel behind her, grunting as he worked to free Leo. The orange glow in the tunnel was getting brighter, the air hotter. She could hear the crackle and roar of the inferno now, a living, breathing monster chasing them down the narrow passage. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. She braced her feet against the earthen wall and threw her entire body weight against the hatch. With a groan of tortured wood, it flew open, and she tumbled out onto a cold stone floor, gasping for air. She was in a small, dark space, the air thick with the earthy smell of potatoes and damp stone. Abel's root cellar. She scrambled up the rickety wooden steps, shoved open another door, and stumbled into the warm, dimly lit interior of a small cabin. At the same moment, Abel emerged from the cellar, carrying a dirt-covered and sobbing Leo in his arms. He slammed the cellar door shut, just as a thick plume of black, acrid smoke began to pour from the opening. They were out. They were safe. Ilara rushed to Leo, pulling him into her arms, holding him tight, rocking him back and forth, murmuring words of comfort she couldn't even hear over the pounding of her own blood in her ears. He was alive. They were alive. Abel moved past them, his face grim, and peered out the small, grimy window of the cabin. Ilara, still holding Leo, forced herself to look. Her breath caught in her throat. A sharp, painful gasp. The sight was one of apocalyptic, terrible beauty that would be burned into her memory forever. The great oak was no longer a tree. It was a pillar of fire, a roaring, colossal torch against the black, star-filled sky. Flames, hundreds of feet high, consumed the ancient branches, turning the treehouse into a black, skeletal silhouette that glowed from within before collapsing into the inferno. The fire roared with a voice of insatiable hunger, casting the entire clearing in a dancing, hellish orange light. Sparks and embers, like a swarm of angry fireflies, swirled into the night, carried away on the wind. It was the funeral pyre of a giant, the destruction of a sanctuary, the erasure of 150 years of history. Ilara watched, mesmerized by the horror, feeling the heat of the blaze even through the cabin's glass. She clutched Leo tighter, her body shaking with a mixture of terror, relief, and a new, cold resolve. They had tried to burn the truth. They had tried to turn the library to ash, but she had escaped, and she held the key to justice, cold and heavy and lead-lined, in her hands. As the last of the treehouse timbers collapsed into the roaring column of fire, Abel turned from the window, his face a grim mask in the flickering orange light. He moved with a sudden, ancient purpose toward a corner of the small cabin, past a wood-burning stove that radiated a comforting warmth against the night's chill. He knelt and pulled back a threadbare rug, revealing a small wooden panel in the floor. From within, he retrieved a heavy, metal-cased radio, its dials and knobs a relic from a bygone era. It was a ham radio. He connected a series of wires with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. Ilara watched, clutching a shivering Leo, the impossible weight of the lead-lined chest, a cold, solid presence beside her. The acrid smell of smoke and gasoline was thick in the air, but inside the cabin, there was only the low, electric hum of the machine coming to life and the quiet, determined focus of the old man. The roaring inferno outside was an act of destruction, but this quiet, deliberate act was the beginning of justice. Abel put on a heavy set of headphones, the leather cracked and worn with age. He twisted a large dial, and the speaker crackled to life, a blizzard of static filling the small room. He twisted it again, slowly, methodically, navigating an invisible landscape of frequencies. The static hissed and popped, a chorus of empty voices from the ether. Then, through the noise, a faint, rhythmic beeping emerged. Morse code. It was a beacon, a secret lighthouse in a storm of chaos. Abel picked up a microphone, his knuckles white as he pressed the transmit button. He didn't speak a name or a location. He spoke in a quiet, coded phrase. "The library is lost, but the book was saved. Jedediah's rest is dark. I repeat, Jedediah's rest is dark." He released the button. For a long, tense moment, there was only static. Ilara held her breath, her heart hammering. Then, a voice came back through the speaker, calm, clear, and professional, a voice from the outside world, from a world of order. "Copy that, Guardian. The book is safe. Stand by. Help is on the way." The rest of the night passed in a surreal, exhausted blur. Abel made them drink hot, sweet coffee, the warmth of the mug a small comfort for Ilara's raw, bleeding palms. Leo, overwhelmed by terror and exhaustion, finally fell into a deep sleep, wrapped in a thick wool blanket on a small cot. Ilara could not sleep. She sat in a wooden chair by the window, the lead-lined chest at her feet, and watched the great oak burn. The fire raged for hours, a pillar of savage beauty, before slowly dying down as the dawn approached. As the first pale, grey light of morning broke over the Appalachian peaks, it revealed the full scope of the devastation. Where the magnificent ancient tree had stood, there was now only a colossal blackened stump, still smouldering, sending plumes of grey smoke into the cold morning air. The ground was a scorched circle of black ash and charred debris. It was a scene of total annihilation, but looking at the ruin, Ilara felt not despair but a cold, hard resolve. They had not erased the history. They had only revealed its grave. They arrived just after sunrise, not the slow, rumbling approach of pickup trucks, but the quiet, professional hum of powerful engines. 3 black SUVs, clean and official, navigated the muddy track with ease and parked in the clearing. Men and women in dark windbreakers with the letters DOJ, Department of Justice, stamped in yellow on the back emerged, moving with a quiet, disciplined efficiency. They were not local, they were federal. The lead agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a face that revealed no emotion, approached the cabin. Abel met her on the porch, and they spoke in low, hushed tones. The agent nodded, her gaze sweeping over the smouldering stump, her expression grim. Ilara, feeling as though she were moving in a dream, stepped out of the cabin. "I'm Ilara Hayes," she said, her voice steady. "The evidence is here." She knelt, and with Abel's help, lifted the heavy lid of the chest. She watched the agent's eyes as she looked upon the gold, the diaries, and the legal documents. It was not surprise she saw, but a grim, weary confirmation of a long-suspected evil. The scene of the arrest was not a dramatic shootout, but a quiet, surgical operation. As federal agents secured the mountain as a crime scene, another team descended upon the Vandergrift estate miles away, a world of manicured lawns and classical music. They found Silas Vandergrift in his silk dressing gown, sitting in his sun-drenched library, a cup of delicate porcelain tea in his hand. The contrast was obscene. There was no resistance. When the agents entered, the mask of the respected philanthropist finally dropped, revealing the cold reptilian predator beneath. The surprise on his face was absolute, quickly replaced by a flash of pure, impotent rage. He said nothing as they read him his rights, his eyes scanning their faces for a sign of weakness, of corruption he could exploit and finding none. The final damning image was the quiet metallic click of the handcuffs closing around his wrists, the sound echoing in the vast, silent library built on a foundation of stolen lives. The empire had begun with murder and theft, and it ended with a man in a silk robe being led away in disgrace. The story exploded into the national consciousness. It was the lead item on every news channel, the headline of every major newspaper. The Vandergrift legacy, 150 years of murder, theft, and deception. The meticulously kept diaries of Jedediah Thorne, authenticated by experts, were released to the public. Their words a powerful, haunting testimony from the grave. Ilara's own story, that of the widowed librarian who had uncovered the vast conspiracy, became a symbol of resilience and unlikely courage. The full weight of the federal government came down on the Vandergrift criminal enterprise, armed with the irrefutable evidence from the chest and the corroborating documents from the historical network Abel's family had maintained, the Department of Justice indicted dozens of co-conspirators, from corporate executives to corrupt county officials. The Vandergrift assets, billions of dollars in land, stocks, and companies, including Vandergrift Logging, were frozen and seized under the RICO Act, dismantled piece by piece. The legal proceedings were long and complex, but the outcome for Ilara was transformative. As the legal heir to the land deeded to her great-great-uncle, a key figure in the abolitionist network, and as the individual whose discovery led directly to the recovery of the vast criminal enterprise, the courts awarded her a substantial portion of the seized assets. It was not a reward, it was ruled as restitution. The stolen gold from Jedediah's Liberation Fund, the seed of the Vandergrift Empire, was finally being returned to its intended lineage. Ilara sat in a sterile lawyer's office, the city skyline gleaming outside the window, as a man in an expensive suit explained the numbers to her. The figures were astronomical, so large they felt like a fiction. She thought of the rickety kitchen table, the feel of the splintered wood, and the sad little pile of $178. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or even joy, but of overwhelming, profound relief. The weight was finally gone. Ilara did not simply disappear into a life of luxury. The money was a tool, a means to finish the work Jedediah Thorne had started. With Abel as her partner, she established the Hayes Thorne Foundation for Historical Justice, dedicating it to the memory of her husband and all the forgotten victims of the Vandergrift regime. Her first act was to use the foundation's resources to purchase all the seized Vandergrift lands in the Appalachian region. Cross-referencing the diaries with old property records, she and a team of pro bono lawyers began the painstaking work of tracking down the living descendants of the families whose land had been stolen, the families whose ancestors had been murdered or sold back into slavery. One by one, in quiet, emotional ceremonies, Ilara returned the deeds to their rightful owners, a symbolic act of healing that resonated across generations. The stolen land, the root of the original crime, was finally coming home. It was not just a legal victory, it was a moral one. The inhabitable treehouse was rebuilt, not as a home for her, but as a monument. Ilara hired the world's best arborists to stabilize the charred, colossal stump of the great oak, ensuring its living core would survive. Upon that mighty base, a team of artisans constructed a faithful replica of Jedediah's Rest, strong and secure, a permanent museum and educational center dedicated to the history of the Underground Railroad in the region. She and Leo now lived in a comfortable, modest house in the nearby valley, a home filled with light, warmth, and the constant smell of baking bread. The suffocating stench of mold and decay was a distant, fading memory. She stood on the new, solid porch of the reconstructed treehouse, looking out at the peaceful forest, her son by her side. He was no longer a pale, frightened boy, but a child filled with laughter, his future a bright, open canvas. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment that was more valuable than all the gold in the world. Her new life was a tapestry woven from the threads of the old. In the evenings, their dinner table was always laden with food, a bounty of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and warm bread, a stark, deliberate contrast to the watery soup of their desperate days. Leo would sit beside the fireplace, sketching in a thick, leather-bound notebook with expensive pencils, his imagination free and unburdened by fear. Ilara had found her purpose, not as a victim of history, but as its custodian, its voice. She had faced down a monster and won, proving that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, holds a power that can topple empires and redeem the forgotten. Her story is a testament to the strength found in desperation and the justice that waits for those brave enough to seek it. What hidden histories lie buried in your own world, waiting for a courageous soul to bring them to light? For more stories of incredible resilience and justice served, subscribe to our channel and become part of the search for truth.